Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the icy winds of medieval Iceland, where justice was not handed out with prison bars or neatly printed law codes, but rather with strange rituals, public shaming, and punishments that make you wonder how anyone managed to take them seriously while also trying to survive blizzards. You're about to sit by a smoky fire in a turf house, the wind rattling the door, and imagine what it felt like to live in a land where your entire life could be upended by a single insult at the wrong feast. And trust me, you probably wouldn't survive this legal system for more than a week unless you're really good at shrugging off banishment or paying fines in goats. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching right now, post in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. I love seeing the global mix of night owls and early birds. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself trudging across frozen ground. The horizon is pale blue and endless, glaciers gleaming like polished glass. Medieval Iceland isn't exactly the place for grand cathedrals or bustling cities. Instead, scattered farmsteads to rugged valleys, turf roofs half buried in snow. This is the world where law is to serve not just as justice, but as survival. There are no kings to boss everyone around, no sheriffs riding out with warrants. Instead, the law lives in gatherings, in memory, and in the voices of those who recite it. The first thing you notice is that Icelanders of this time loved order almost as much as they loved a good saga. They lived by a code called Gragas, literally Grey Goose laws. And no, that has nothing to do with vodka. Historians still argue whether the name came from the gray covers of the manuscripts or just some poetic farmer who liked geese. Either way, it's a collection that tells people what happens if you steal a sheep or call your neighbor's wife something unflattering or, heaven forbid, practice witchcraft when you should be milking cows. You're standing in this cold land, and the odd thing is, punishments here don't usually mean death. Unlike many parts of medieval Europe where heads roll like bowling balls, Icelanders had a curious tendency to exile rather than execute. They figured, why waste blood when you could just tell someone to leave the island? Or worse, to stick around while everyone pretends you don't exist. Imagine being ghosted not just by one friend, but by an entire country. That's outlawry, and it will become one of the strangest penalties you'll ever hear about. But before we get to that, let's soak in the atmosphere. You walk past a farmhouse where smoke rises from peat fires. The smell of dried fish clings to everything. In the distance, you hear sheep bells tinkling. This land is harsh, so every rule has to keep the balance. If one person lashes out too hard, feuds explode, families burn each other's homes, and suddenly winter claims even more lives than usual. So the laws of Iceland were designed not only to punish, but to keep the fragile community from cracking apart. One mainstream historical fact you should know. Iceland had one of the earliest parliaments in Europe, the Althing, founded around the year 930. Picture thousands of people gathering each summer at Thingvellir, camping out, swapping goods, and listening to legal decisions announced from a central rock. It was law and festival rolled into one. Like if your local courthouse also doubled as Coachella, minus the music, unless you count drunk men singing about their ancestors. Here's the quirky tidbit. Punishment sometimes came in the form of mockery. If you insulted someone wrongly, the tables could turn, and you might find yourself saddled with a humiliating nickname for life. People back then remembered these names for generations. Being called Goatbeard or Dungskin was no small thing. It could travel down family sagas like a permanent stain. Forget prison. Here, humiliation could outlive you. But historians still argue whether the saga's colorful punishments are historically accurate or partly exaggerated for dramatic storytelling. Were all these quirky penalties really handed down in courts? Or did storytellers spice them up around the fire to keep listeners awake through long, dark winters? Probably a mix of both. The sagas blend truth with embellishment, and you're left drifting between fact and legend, which is exactly where sleep finds you. As you settle deeper into night, you sense how peculiar justice feels here. Icy, improvised, and oddly poetic. You'll soon step into the gatherings themselves, where punishment are not whispered in secret chambers, but shouted across valleys, carried by wind and echo, until even the sheep look up as if they've been summoned to bear witness. You shuffle your feet across the uneven ground until you reach a wide plain ringed by jagged cliffs. It's summer, finally, and the snow has melted just enough to make travel possible. All around you, families pitch their tents, merchants set up stalls, and curious children chase each other between the horses. This is Thingvellir, the place where the Althing gathers, and you're about to watch law unfold in one of the most unusual courts in the medieval world. The air buzzes not with the roar of engines or city noise, but with voices, deep chants of genealogies, the clink of silver scales, the sound of being traded. People come here not only for judgment, but for gossip, betrothals, and a bit of spectacle. And right at the center rises the Logberg, the Law Rock. That's where the Ugskummer, the law speaker, climbs up and recites the law from memory. No paper in his hands, just centuries of memorized rulings stored in his head. Imagine being the human equivalent of a legal hard drive, with no USB port to back yourself up. One solid fact: the Althing was not a small, private affair. It was a national event, bringing together chieftains known as goði, free farmers, and anyone with a case to argue. Iceland had no king at this time, so the assembly was the highest authority. It's hard not to be impressed. A stateless society maintaining order through sheer consensus and an unshakable love of storytelling. Now here's the quirky part. Attending the Althing was almost like going to a medieval festival. People came not just to sue each other, but to sell ale, arrange marriages, and even put on little plays. There were booths for trading goods, like dried fish and walrus ivory. Some sagas even suggest that people brought along their best clothes to show off, because nothing says "please respect my lawsuit" like a brand new cloak trimmed with reindeer fur. As you lean closer to the crowd, you notice how cases are announced. A man steps forward and shouts his accusation, his voice echoing across the plain. He names a defendant, states the crime, and then everyone holds their breath for the ruling. There's no hushed jury room, no solemn gavel. Instead, it's the open air, the sound of ravens overhead, and sometimes a chorus of jeers if the case is particularly absurd. Historians still argue whether the Althing was more about enforcing justice or about displaying power. Was it truly democratic, or just a place where chieftains flex their influence? The sagas give us hints, but the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, any free farmer could technically bring a case. On the other hand, the outcome often depended on which chieftain you had in your corner and how many supporters you could muster. Think of it less like a courtroom drama and more like a medieval popularity contest, but with sheep instead of Instagram likes. You picture yourself standing there, wrapped in a woolen cloak, trying not to sneeze from the smoke drifting off campfires. The smell of roasting lamb mingles with the sweat of horses. Somewhere, a skald recites a poem about an ancestor who once insulted a king and lived to regret it. Every sound, every smell becomes part of the court's atmosphere, reminding you that law in this land is inseparable from daily life. And if you think trials were boring, remember that they could escalate into duels or feuds. One accusation might ripple into generations of grudges, told and retold until grandchildren were still fighting over who stole a cow in 1043. Meanwhile, merchants just hoped everyone would calm down long enough to buy their smoked fish. As the sun hangs low, never fully setting in the Icelandic summer, you realize you're witnessing something that feels both ordinary and surreal. People lean on their spears. Children chase sheep through the crowd, and at the center, the law speaker's voice rolls out like a lullaby of rules. No written documents, just memory and performance. It's legal theater, and you have a front row seat, drifting gently towards sleep as a murmur of Icelandic justice wraps around you like a blanket. You stand there at Thingvellir, listening to the law speaker's words wash over the assembly like waves on basalt rock, when suddenly the mood shifts. Someone mentions the word tleg. Outlawry. The crowd stirs. This is not a punishment of whips or stocks. It is, in its way, much colder. You sense it in Iceland, where death sentences were rare. Outlawry was a tool that kept order without staining the soil with blood. Outlawry meant you no longer had the protection of law. Anyone could strike you down, take your belongings, and not be punished for it. You became invisible in the eyes of society, like a ghost wandering the lava fields. And honestly, being ghosted by your entire community is worse than a bad breakup text. at least a breakup, doesn't usually come with the risk of starving in the wilderness. The mainstream fact here is simple. Full outlawry was permanent. If you were declared a Skagangramar, a forest walker, you had no right to stay in Iceland. You had to leave the island within a set time, often 3 months. If you stayed, anyone could kill you, and in fact, some ambitious neighbors might see it as an opportunity. Your land could be seized, your livestock redistributed, and your family left to pick up the pieces. The quirky detail? Even though exile sounds absolute, sagas are full of tales where outlaws still lingered in Iceland, hiding in caves, sneaking food, and occasionally popping up like medieval jump scares at local farms. Some became folk heroes, almost like Robin Hood figures, men who live on the margins but whose stories entertain generations. Gregor the Strong, for instance, became legendary for his outlaw adventures, though he was said to fight trolls along the way. Trolls might be optional in legal documents, but not in sagas. Now, historians still argue whether outlawry was more symbolic than strictly enforced. Did everyone really go around hunting exiles the way the laws allowed, or was it more about shaming the family and creating pressure to leave? The saga suggests both. Some outlaws were hunted down and killed. Others managed to survive for years, proving that punishment on paper doesn't always translate to action on icy ground. You look around at the assembly. Imagine being declared an outlaw here, with thousands watching, your name shouted from the Lorok, your neighbors whispering, calculating whether they could claim your goats by next week. You'd feel the weight of silence, because suddenly no one could help you. Even a cousin who loved you yesterday would hesitate, knowing that the law had erased you like chalk in the rain. As you trudge mentally through this concept, you see how practical it was in a place with no prisons. Building jails would have been ridiculous in Iceland. Stone and timber were too precious, and who would guard them in the middle of endless snow? Exile was cheap, efficient, and it solved the problem by making it someone else's problem. It's a little like unsubscribing from an annoying email list, just with higher stakes and fewer polite confirmation messages. You picture an outlaw stumbling across lava fields, carrying nothing but dried fish and a wool cloak, always looking over his shoulder. He might try to sneak back to visit family at night, whispering to his children through the turf walls. Or he might live in the wild, building a shelter out of driftwood. The isolation itself was punishment enough. A life sentence carved not in stone, but in loneliness. And yet, outlawry fascinated people so much that storytellers couldn't leave it alone. They wove into sagas as a dramatic backdrop. A man's honor destroyed, his courage tested, his fate sealed by exile. You can almost hear the skalds chanting by firelight. He became an outlaw, wandering with shadows as his only companions. And somewhere in the back of the hall, someone probably chuckled and said, "Better than paying that goat fine, though." As you stand in this strange twilight of history, the silence of outlawry begins to feel like the perfect punishment for sleep. Not pain, not gore, just endless wandering on the edge of society, muffled by snow and memory. You drift with him into the forest, unseen, unloved, but somehow still alive. You're still a Thingvalar, leaning against a cold boulder, when someone mentions that not all outlawries were created equal. Like ordering at a medieval cafe, there were two main options on the punishment menu: full outlawry and lesser outlawry. Each had its own flavor of misery, and neither came with whipped cream on top. Full outlawry, as you already know, meant permanent exile. You were erased from the law, a shadow without protection. But lesser outlawry, called Furbolgsgar, was a slightly more forgiving sentence. Instead of being cast out forever, you were exiled for 3 years. During that time, you had to leave Iceland entirely, and only after serving your wandering penalty could you return. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a 3-year backpacking trip you didn't actually want to take. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The law laid out the difference very clearly. Full outlawry was for the most serious crimes, like murder, repeated theft, or certain kinds of violent insults that ripped apart family honor. Lesser outlawry was for crimes that were bad, but not catastrophic. Maybe you killed someone accidentally, or you burned a neighbor's shed in a drunken rage. You'd still be punished, but society dangled a little carrot of eventual return. The quirky tidbit is how precise the laws could get. For example, If you accidentally killed someone while defending yourself, that might lead to lesser outlawry rather than full. It wasn't just a yes/no decision. It involved hair-splitting debates, witnesses, and a subtle art convincing the assembly that your axe swing was mostly defensive. Some sagas even describe men arguing that the victim had slipped or provoked a fight, as though medieval juries loved a good plot twist. Historians still argue whether these distinctions were consistently enforced. Did every accidental killing really result in 3 years abroad? Or was it up to local power brokers to decide who suffered the harsh fate? The surviving law codes say one thing, but the sagas sometimes contradict them. Maybe the truth is that rules look neat on parchment, but messy in practice, like trying to play chess with half the pieces missing. Now, imagine being sentenced to lesser outlawry. You'd have to pack up quickly and head to the coast, praying you could find a ship willing to take you abroad. Maybe Norway, maybe the British Isles, maybe somewhere in the Baltic where no one cared if you had an Icelandic nickname that translated as barn burner. The hardest part wouldn't be the travel itself, though. It would be leaving your farm, your family, your animals, knowing you'd be gone for 3 long years while others use your land. You picture the shame at the assembly, neighbors whispering, "Oh, it's only lesser outlawry. He'll be back." Yet those 3 years could change everything. Crops would fail without you, debts might pile up, and someone else might buy your property with a little too much interest. Coming back could feel like returning to a home that no longer wanted you. A sly modern comparison? It's like getting suspended from school for a semester. You technically come back, but everyone remembers what you did, and the reputation sticks. Only here, instead of detention, you might have spent 3 winters freezing on a foreign shore. What makes this even more curious is how exile fit Iceland's geography. It's an island at the edge of the known world. Leaving wasn't just a boat ride. It was a leap into uncertainty. Some exiles probably never made it back, swept away by storms or settling in distant lands. In that sense, lesser outlawry could be a gamble, return to fate aloud, or vanish into fog forever. And so, as you watch a man hear a sentence, you see his shoulders slump. He nods, accepts the ruling, and begins making plans for a voyage he never wanted. Around him, the assembly buzzes with other cases, but for him, the clock has already started ticking. The difference between 3 years and forever might be written in the law. But in his heart, both feel like banishment. As you drift on the thought, the idea of exile becomes almost hypnotic, a punishment measured not by chains or lashes, but by absence. You can almost hear the gulls crying, smell the salt spray, and feel the endless ocean that lies between crime and redemption. The crowd at Thingler thins slightly as traders return to their booths, but one group leans closer to the Lorrock. Someone has just invoked an ancient and nerve-wracking method of proving innocence. Trial by ordeal. You pull your cloak tighter, because even the thought of it makes you shiver in the brisk Icelandic air. The mainstream historical fact is that ordeals were practiced across medieval Europe, but in Iceland, they carried a distinctly local flavor. One of the most infamous was the ordeal of hot iron or boiling water. Imagine standing before your neighbors while priests heat a cauldron until bubbles roll thick as porridge. You, the accused, must plunge your hand into that steaming water to retrieve a stone or a ring. Afterward, your burned hand is wrapped and sealed. Days later, officials unwrap it, peering at the blisters. If the wound looked clean, God had proven your innocence. If it festered, you were guilty. Not exactly the kind of dermatology anyone would want to sign up for. The quirky tidbit? Icelanders sometimes adjusted these rituals for practical reasons. In some records, the ordeal involved carrying red-hot iron across a certain number of paces. Picture yourself walking slowly, trying not to drop glowing metal, while a dozen neighbors judge how evenly your skin sizzles. It's absurd, terrifying, and oddly theatrical. The saga suggests that people even speculated about whether dipping one's hand in sheep fat first might help. A medieval version of life hacks, though not one endorsed by doctors. Historians still argue whether ordeals were truly common in Iceland or whether they were more symbolic, carried out only in rare and extreme cases. Archaeological evidence is scarce, and the sagas may exaggerate for drama. Did people really believe God managed blisters like a meticulous physician? Or was the real point to intimidate defendants into confessing before things got painfully hot? As you picture it, you can almost hear the crowd murmuring, torn between pity and curiosity. The smell of boiling water mingles with the ever-present tang of smoked fish. A priest mutters prayers, his voice rising with the steam. The accused, perhaps trembling, steps forward, face pale in the pale northern light. The entire scene feels less like law and more like a ritual test of nerves, a public spectacle to remind everyone what happens when disputes spiral too far. You sense how ordeals fit into Iceland's broader legal culture. This is a land without dungeons or guards. Law relies on community memory, reputation, and rituals that everyone accepts however strange they seem. By subjecting someone to ordeal, society dramatizes justice, turning guilt or innocence into a story that neighbors will repeat for years. And in a culture where sagas are half the currency of memory, that may be the real punishment. A modern joke sneaks in here. It's as if instead of cross-examining you in court, today's judges ask you to hold a curling iron on high heat and then check your palm later. Not exactly the kind of spa treatment you'd leave a 5-star review for. As you drift into the thought, you picture quiet afterward. The cauldron steam fades, the accused is bandaged, and the assembly goes back to trading sheep and arranging marriages. Life carries on, yet the ordeal lingers in everyone's minds, a vivid warning that justice here is not hidden behind walls, but staged under the open sky. The wind brushes your face, cool and steady, as if to soothe the imagined burns. Sleep comes gently when you realize that in medieval Iceland, guilt and innocence often balance on the thin skin of a hand plunged into boiling water. The murmur at the Althing shifts again, and this time the word that ripples through the crowd is holmgang, the duel. You tug your cloak around your shoulders and lean in, because you know this one won't involve boiling water or scalded fingers. Instead, it's the promise of two people standing across from one another, weapons in hand, with law and honor balanced precariously on the tip of a blade. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Holmgang duels were once an accepted part of Icelandic law and Norse custom. When two men disputed land, insult, or inheritance, they could legally settle it by combat. But unlike the chaotic brawls you might imagine, these duels were ritualized. A square was marked out, sometimes literally measured with a cloak or ropes, and each fighter was expected to follow strict rules. If you stepped outside the marked ground, you lost. It wasn't simply fight to the death, but more like a grim athletic contest under the eyes of your peers. The quirky detail? The word holmgang literally means island walk. That's because in some early traditions, duels took place on small islets, forcing combatants to stay within bounds. By Iceland's time, the ritual ground symbolized that island. Some accounts even describe participants taking turns striking blows, almost like a bizarre version of turn-based combat. Imagine waiting politely while the other guy swings an axe at you, then dusting yourself off and saying, "Okay, now it's my turn." Historians still argue whether holmgang was really fair or whether it was a sneaky way for powerful men to intimidate rivals. Did both parties truly agree, or was one pressured into the fight? The sagas dramatize duels endlessly, but the legal text suggests that by the 11th century, holmgang was frowned upon and eventually outlawed. Still, echoes of it lingered in storytelling, because nothing spices up a saga like two men circling each other in a tense silence while the crowd watches. You imagine the scene. The crowd clears, marking the square on the ground. Two men step inside, weapons glinting in the pale sun. Their breaths fog in the air, though it's summer. Someone calls out the rules, reminding them that this is supposed to be civilized bloodshed. And then silence. You can feel the tension in your chest, the mix of dread and fascination, because this is justice in a land with no prisons. A duel that everyone must witness and remember. Yet here's the irony. Holmgang wasn't always about killing. Sometimes a duel ended quickly if one man yielded or was wounded. In fact, sagas describe moments where combatants reached agreements mid-fight, shouting terms over the clash of steel. Imagine being so practical that even while parrying a sword, you can negotiate property rights. Medieval Icelanders may not have invented mediation, but they certainly found creative ways to multitask. As you drift with this imagery, you realize that duels were part performance, They showed the community that disputes had a resolution, even if it meant letting fate or swordsmanship decide. And in a society where honor was as fragile as a thin ice sheet, the spectacle mattered as much as the outcome. You let your mind wander. The sound of steel ringing, the gasp of onlookers, the smell of grass underfoot, the sudden hush when a fighter stumbles. The duel ends one way or another and life goes on. People return to their booths, their gossip, their sheep, but the memory of the home gang remains, retold for years in sagas by firelight. And as you curl deeper into thought, it becomes soothing in its rhythm. Two men circling, trading blows under the cold Icelandic sky, locked not just in combat, but in ritual history, and the endless need to settle honor. The air at Thingvellir feels lighter after the duel settles, but your ears perk up when you hear the word shaming. Unlike duels or outlawry, this punishment didn't involve blood or exile. It involved your pride, your reputation, and sometimes your ability to show your face at the next feast. In medieval Iceland, humiliation could cut sharper than any sword, and once a nickname stuck, good luck shaking it off. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Verbal insults, particularly accusations that question a man's honor or masculinity, were taken extremely seriously in Icelandic law. To call someone a coward, a womanly man, or to suggest infidelity could spark lawsuits, feuds, or worse. Legal texts spell out that certain words were enough to justify deadly retaliation if not addressed properly. This wasn't casual banter. In a society built on reputation, a single insult could ruin your standing. The quirky tidbit? Punishment often meant the tables were turned. If you accused someone wrongly or too crudely, you could be forced to endure ridicule yourself. That's where mocking songs and nicknames came in. Imagine an entire community singing a ditty about you being sheep-nose or dung-beard, and knowing that centuries later, a saga writer might still record it. Some sagas even describe carved wooden poles called NSDNG, planted with insulting runes or top of a horse's head, pointing at an enemy's land as a magical, humiliating curse. It was like posting a medieval billboard that read, "Everyone laugh at this guy." Historians still argue whether these punishments were consistently legal sentences or more like community-driven shaming rituals. Did the Althing actually assign nicknames, or did people just organically start using them until they became impossible to shake? The surviving texts are unclear, leaving us to imagine a blurry space between official punishment and social bullying. You picture the scene. A man stands accused of lying about his neighbor. The law speaker announces that his slander is unjustified. Instead of a duel or exile, the assembly bursts into laughter as someone coins a new nickname on the spot. It catches on instantly, passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire. From that day forward, he's no longer Bjorn the farmer, but Bjorn Kaltung. And when winter comes, people will still be chuckling about it around the fire. In a land without prisons or stocks, shaming made sense. It cost nothing, required no guards, and ensured that the punishment lived on in memory. Worse still, your children might inherit the laughter. Saga audiences love these details. They make characters feel real, flawed, and memorable. And if you think about it, maybe modern nicknames in high school hallways aren't so far removed from medieval Icelandic justice. Only difference, no horses' heads nailed to poles in the cafeteria. Thankfully, as you drift with the thought, the punishment begins to feel almost gentle compared to outlawry or duels. No boiling water, no exile, just the sting of knowing your name is forever tied to a joke. Yet in some ways, that's harsher, because humiliation never really heals. It echoes whispered in sagas, sung in verses, carved into memory like runes on stone. The wind at Thingvellir carries laughter across the plain, mingling with the sound of sheep and ravens. You breathe it in, and the rhythm of ridicule becomes oddly soothing. A punishment without chains, just words that wrap around you until you almost smile at the absurdity. In Iceland, law could humiliate you into silence, and tonight, that laughter lulls you slowly towards sleep. The next morning at Thingvellir, the air smells of smoke and roasted lamb, but the talk among farmers is not of duels or insults. It's about silver, livestock, and the quiet click of scales. You realize that the backbone of Icelandic justice wasn't always humiliation or exile. More often, it was about compensation fines, payments designed to keep blood feuds from spiraling into endless cycles of revenge. The mainstream historical fact: Iceland's legal system revolved around the principle of word guild or man price. Every person's life and injuries were valued in silver or goods, and if someone harmed another, they were expected to pay a fine to restore balance. Killing a man? Pay his family. Injuring him? Pay for the wound, sometimes calculated by its location. Even knocking out a tooth had its price. The logic was simple: settle with silver, not swords. The quirky tidbit is how specific and sometimes absurd these fines could be. Some laws listed payment for injuries as if ordering from a bizarre medieval menu. So many ounces of silver for a finger, more for an eye, and double for a blow that damaged someone's honor. And it wasn't always just silver. Livestock, cloth, and even ale could stand in for payment. Imagine someone showing up to court with 3 sheep and a barrel of beer, saying, "Let's call it even." Historians still argue whether these fines were always fair or tilted heavily toward the wealthy. Could poorer farmers realistically pay off such debts, or did fines push them closer to outlawry when they failed? The sagas show both outcomes. Some men managed to scrape together payments with help from allies, while others fell into ruin, their inability to pay turning them into fugitives. You picture the scene. 2 families stand before the assembly, tense but restrained. Instead of reaching for swords, they count out silver coins onto a cloth, each clink echoing through the crowd. The law speaker nods. The families exchange solemn looks. And just like that, a potential blood feud ends with the weight of metal rather than blood. And yet, compensation fines carry their own kind of humiliation. Paying meant admitting guilt, or at least responsibility. Even if you insisted the fight wasn't your fault, handing over livestock branded you in the eyes of your neighbors. And for proud Icelanders, that sting could hurt more than losing a few goats. A modern aside slips in here. It's a little like settling a lawsuit today. You might not admit fault publicly, but everyone knows you didn't fork over that much money just for fun. The story spreads faster than the coins ever did. As you wander among the tents, you hear the rhythm of deals being struck. Silver weighed, sheep bleating, agreements muttered under the endless summer light. There are no written receipts, just memory and the community's collective witness. It's strangely soothing to imagine a world where justice sounded like coins on scales, not gavel slamming. The longer you listen, the more hypnotic it feels. Compensation fines hum like background music, steady and predictable. No fire, no spectacle. Just a quiet assurance that peace can be bought, debts can be measured, and balance can be restored with a handful of silver under the Icelandic sky. As you drift along the assembly grounds, your attention is caught by a case that doesn't involve men at all. A woman stands before the crowd, her cloak pulled close, her voice steady though the whispers ripple through the onlookers. You realize that punishments in medieval Iceland carried different weights depending on gender, and though women could bring cases and defend their rights, the consequences they faced were often shaped by societal expectations rather than brute force. The mainstream historical fact: Icelandic women had more legal standing than many of their contemporaries in Europe. They could inherit property, request divorce, and appear at the Althing to press claims. But when it came to punishment, women were rarely subjected to outlawry or duel. Instead, they were more often fined, shamed, or bound by social restrictions. If a woman killed someone, exile could still apply. But for lesser disputes, law and community leaned toward ridicule or financial penalties. The quirky tidbit is that women sometimes weaponized poetry and mockery in disputes. Instead of raising swords, they might compose verses or sling biting insults, which in turn could land them in legal hot water. Imagine being fined for writing a roast poem about your neighbor's beard. Funny at the feast, less so when you're paying silver sheep the next morning. Some sagas even show women punished for inciting men into fights, treated as if their sharp tongues carried as much weight as weapons. Historians still argue whether women's punishments were truly lighter or simply different. Were fines more merciful, or did they effectively strip women of economic security in a land where livestock and land meant survival? Some scholars suggest a shaming element was harsher for women, since reputation tied directly into marriage prospects and household honor. Others point out that sagas often highlight women's clever manipulation of the law, suggesting they were anything but passive victims. You picture this woman now, standing in the sunlight, accused of slandering a neighbor's household. The law speaker listens, frowning slightly, then announces a penalty, a fine in cloth and wool, and public recitation of an apology. The crowd chuckles softly as she mutters the words, her pride more wounded than her purse. And yet, when she walks away, you sense she's already composing a sharper verse to recite at the next feast. The atmosphere tells you that justice here wasn't simply about punishment. It was about maintaining balance between men and women, households and families. A duel between women was rare, though saga writers sometimes imagined them for drama. Instead, penalties for women leaned into reputation, community whispers, and economic strain. As you let this image settle, you realize how peculiar it feels. Punishment without chains, but with words, silver, and status. In the end, being laughed at in your own valley might hurt worse than exile across the sea. The wind tugs gently at your cloak. The crowd disperses again, murmuring about the outcome, and the woman's figure disappears into the swirl of tents and livestock. Justice lingers like a faint echo, softer than swords, yet no less binding. You wander past the stalls of fish and wool, still replaying the cases of fines and insults in your mind, when a darker reality emerges. A man stands accused, but as the law speaker recites the judgment, you notice the punishment doesn't fall only on him. The words are clear. When someone is outlawed, their entire household feels a blow. In Icelandic law, family honor was not just an accessory. It was a spine holding everything upright. When it broke, everyone suffered. The mainstream historical fact. In medieval Iceland, law and honor were collective. If one family member committed a crime, the shame and consequences could ripple through the whole kin group. An outlaw's relatives might lose property, social standing, or even safety, because feuds often spread like wildfire. That's why so much emphasis was placed on paying fines and resolving disputes quickly. Families want to contain dishonor before it consumed them. The quirky tidbit? Sometimes the punishment for a crime meant your relatives had to step in and pay compensation for you. Imagine stealing a cow. Only have your cousins show up at the Althing with purses of silver, muttering under their breath about your poor impulse control. The law encouraged kin to take responsibility for each other, which sounds noble until you're the unlucky cousin selling sheep to cover a nephew's bad behavior. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on collective honor kept communities stable or only deepened feuds. Did families rally together to protect one another, or did resentment simmer beneath the surface when one man's crime dragged everyone down? The sagas give us both pictures. Heroic kin defending their own, and bitter relatives who wish the troublemaker had just fallen into a fjord before causing so much trouble. You picture it now. The outlaw standing alone, head bowed, as the law speaker announces his fate. Behind him, his wife clutches their child. His brothers whisper nervously. His father stares at the ground. They all know what it means. Neighbors will avoid them. Markets will feel colder, and every conversation will circle back to the shame carved into their name. It's punishment by isolation, not just of one man, but of everyone tied to him. In a small society, that collective punishment worked like glue and knife at the same time. Glue, because it kept people watching each other, urging restraint. Knife, because one mistake could sever ties and bleed honor across generations. You can almost hear in the sagas, so-and-so's descendants still bore the shame of that theft. Imagine your great-grandchildren rolling their eyes because you couldn't resist pocketing a goat in 1013. A modern aside sneaks in here. It's like when a student gets in trouble and the whole class has to stay after school. Except in this case, the class is your extended family, and the detention might last for decades. As the crowd disperses, you notice the outlaw's relatives walking slowly, their shoulders hunched, already marked by association. No shackles, no guards, just a heavy silence of neighbors refusing to make eye contact. That silence is punishment enough, stretching across meadows, echoing in sagas, whispered long after man himself is gone. The wind rustles through the grass at Thingvellir, carrying that silence like a shadow. You feel it settle around you, a reminder that in medieval Iceland, you never bore judgment alone. Your family carried it with you, like a cloak you could not shed. You wander further to the bustle of Thingvellir, past horses stamping their hooves and children playing with carved wooden toys, when a sudden hush rolls over the assembly. The word whispered this time is seer, sorcery. In a land of sagas and superstition, magic was not just a bedtime story. It was a crime, and the punishments for dabbling in it could be as eerie as the practices themselves. The mainstream historical fact: sorcery in medieval Iceland was officially punishable, though the severity varied depending on the act. Simple spells or charms might earn fines or shaming, while more dangerous forms of magic, especially those thought to harm livestock or people, could lead to outlawry or, in rare cases, execution. With Christianity spreading after the year 1000, penalties tightened further as the church pushed for a harsher treatment of pagan practices. The quirky tidbit: some sagas describe trials where evidence of sorcery included strange objects, carved staffs, odd runes on bones, or bags filled with animal parts. Imagine someone pulling out a pouch of feathers and herbs, and a crowd gasping as if they'd just uncovered a medieval version of illegal fireworks. In one saga, a man accused of witchcraft allegedly turned into a seal to escape. Though whether that's law or legend, historians leave us to decide. Historians still argue whether accusations of sorcery were genuine fears or just convenient weapons in legal disputes. Was your neighbor really cursing your sheep, or did you simply want his land? With no clear way to prove magic, trials often leaned on rumor, dreams, or odd coincidences. The line between superstition and strategy blurred, and the accused could find themselves punished for little more than being disliked. You picture the scene: a woman accused of brewing charms to influence a neighbor's cattle. The law speaker listens as witnesses describe her humming strange songs at night, her hair loose in the wind. The assembly murmurs nervously, torn between fear and curiosity. In the end, the judgment is exile for a set period, her property seized as payment. She walks away slowly, eyes on the ground, her reputation dissolving into whispers. And here's the unsettling part: punishment for sorcery often carried a ritual edge. Some accounts mention burning items associated with magic, casting them into fire, or burying them at crossroads. Fire symbolized purification, a way of cleansing community of invisible threats. For the accused, it wasn't just about losing goats or silver. It was about being branded as someone whose very presence felt dangerous. You let yourself drift with the thought: smoke rising from a pile of ruins, the crackle of fire, the hush of a crowd pretending they are safe again. The woman disappears into exile, but her story remains, feeding sagas and fireside tales for generations. A modern joke sneaks in softly. It's like accusing your neighbor of hacking your Wi-Fi, except instead of a stern conversation, the whole community votes to kick you off the island. And no, they won't let you back once you reset the password. As the smoke fades in your mind, you realize sorcery punishments were less about proof and more about fear. Fear of the unseen, the unexplained, the odd person who stood a little apart from everyone else. That fear, wrapped in ritual and law, created punishments that linger like shadows on the tundra. The wind brushes past you again, and the silence after the fire feels almost like a spell itself. Soft, heavy, and oddly soothing as you drift deeper into Iceland's strange, mystical justice. The smell of smoke still lingers in your mind when you notice another group stepping forward to the Althing. Not warriors or farmers this time, but priests in simple robes. The church has been spreading its roots through Iceland since the conversion around the year 1000. And with it comes a whole new layer of punishments, mixing sacred judgment with the old laws. You see how secular and spiritual justice intertwine, sometimes smoothly, sometimes awkwardly, like two neighbors sharing a fence but arguing over where the boundary actually lies. The mainstream historical fact: after Iceland officially adopted Christianity, the church gained authority to regulate morality, and its laws overlapped with the secular codes of the Althing. Crimes that had once been handled through fines or exile now carried moral weight. Adultery, blasphemy, or failing to keep holy days could draw penalties enforced by priests. The church insisted that the soul's salvation mattered as much as the community's peace. The quirky tidbit: some punishments were surprisingly creative, almost theatrical. For example, a man might be ordered to fast on bread and water for weeks, or to stand barefoot at the church door during services, begging forgiveness from everyone entering. Imagine starting your Sunday by walking past your neighbor, who has to mutter apologies with his toes freezing on the stone threshold. That's penitence as public performance. Historians still argue whether the church's influence truly reformed Icelandic society or simply layered new moral codes on top of old practices. Did people genuinely embrace Christian discipline, or did they nod along at Mass and then go home to settle disputes the old-fashioned way? With duels, insults, and goat fines? The sagas often portray priests as figures of compromise, trying to steer fiery Icelanders toward peace, but not always succeeding. You picture it now. A priest standing at Thingvellir, his voice carrying across the crowd, declaring a punishment not in silver or livestock, but in days of fasting and public humility. Some nod approvingly, others roll their eyes. A proud farmer grumbles, "I'd rather pay a sheep than skip my supper." Yet the judgment is passed, and the man bows his head, knowing that spiritual shame can be as binding as worldly law. The atmosphere feels different. There's less of the raucous humor that accompanies insults or goat fines, more of a solemn hush, as if everyone senses the weight of eternal judgment hanging behind these punishments. Still, in practice, you know people probably gossip about who broke their fast or who muttered prayers half-heartedly. Even in sacred law, Icelanders found ways to blend seriousness with everyday wit. A modern aside comes to mind. It's like being sentenced to community service today, except instead of picking up trash on the roadside, you're told to kneel in front of your whole neighborhood until your knees hurt. Effective? Maybe. Embarrassing? Definitely. As the priests finish, the crowd disperses back to their tents, some thoughtful, some chuckling. The church has spoken, but the sagas remind you that old and new laws never merge seamlessly. They rubbed against each other, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes contradicting. That friction created punishments that were half prayer, half performance, a peculiar blend of salvation and sheep counting. The breeze carries the faint sound of church bells from a distant valley, blending with the bleating of goats. You let the two sounds merge in your ears, sacred and ordinary, until they blur into a rhythm that lulls you deeper, as if law itself were a lullaby sung in two voices. The bustle at Thingvellir picks up again. Merchants weighing silver, farmers trading wool, children chasing sheep. But your gaze fixes on a grim detail whisper among the crowd. Property seizures. You realize that when the law stripped someone of rights, it didn't stop with exile or shaming. It reached right into their barns, their fields, their very hearth, and pulled everything apart like threads unraveling from a cloak. The mainstream historical fact. When someone was outlawed, their property could legally be confiscated and redistributed. Farms, animals, tools, everything was up for grabs. In theory, the goods might go to the injured party or their kin as compensation. In practice, ambitious neighbors and chieftains often found ways to benefit. Justice in Iceland was as much about redistributing resources as punishing crime. The quirky tidbit? Confiscated goods weren't always practical treasures. Sagas describe families inheriting odd items, half-broken tools, useless ornaments, or even livestock so ornery that no one wanted them. Imagine being compensated for a feud with a pair of goats that keep chewing through your fence. Technically, justice was served, but you'd still be chasing goats all night. Historians still argue whether property seizures stabilized communities or fueled further disputes. Did redistributing land ease tensions? Or did it create new resentments when neighbors suddenly lived on farms that once belonged to exile families? Archaeological surveys of abandoned farmsteads hint that some properties were never successfully passed on, standing empty as silent reminders of shame and punishment. You picture the scene, an outlaw's family forced to stand by while their farm is measured and catalogued. A chieftain's men lead away cattle, the sound of hooves on stony ground echoing like a drumbeat. Neighbors shuffle awkwardly, half ashamed and half curious, as spoils are tallied. A child clings to her mother's skirt, staring at strangers walking through her house as if they own it, which by law, they now do. The atmosphere is heavy. Seizure doesn't just punish the guilty, it uproots entire households. Even innocent relatives are stripped of comfort, forced into dependence on others. It's punishment that bleeds across boundaries, turning neighbors into scavengers of misfortune. You can almost hear the sagas framing it as tragic poetry. The farm fell silent, its hearth cold, its cattle scattered. And yet, some found dark humor in it. Gossip spread quickly about who ended up with what. If a chieftain sees an outlaw's prize cloak only to find it moth-eaten, people would chuckle at the irony. Justice was serious, but Icelanders still relish a joke, especially when it poked at pride. A modern aside fits easily. It's like having your car repossessed for debt, only to find your neighbor driving it badly around town, waving cheerfully as if nothing happened. You'd stew with resentment, but the law would just shrug and say, "Balance restored." The sound of sheep bleating drifts into your ears, blending with the imagined cries of families watching their farms emptied. Property seizure feels harsher than duel or insult, less dramatic, but far more devastating. It strikes not only at honor, but at survival itself. As the crowd disperses, you sense the silence of abandoned homesteads lingering in the Icelandic air. Turf walls collapsing, fires gone cold, children's laughter faded into memory. The punishment is not a moment, but a ghost that haunts valleys for generations. That ghost seems to whisper around you now, steady and soft, until your eyelids grow heavy. The crowd stirs again, but this time it isn't about silver, goats, or exile. A chieftain steps forward with a curious proposal. Instead of paying fines or sending men into wilderness, why not end a feud with a marriage? You blink in surprise, because here in medieval Iceland, justice could sometimes mean being paired off with someone you might never have chosen. The mainstream historical fact. Enforced or arranged marriages were occasionally used to settle disputes and restore peace between feuding families. If two households had spilled blood or hurled insults that threatened to spiral out of control, a union could bind them together, turning enemies into in-laws. The law didn't always mandate outright, but the assembly often endorsed such settlements as a practical way to keep communities from tearing apart. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe highly awkward pairings where neither party was particularly thrilled. Imagine being forced to marry the daughter of the man you had just insulted in verse. She might glare at you over the stew pot for the next 20 years, but technically the feud was resolved. In one tale, a reluctant bride was so unimpressed with her enforced match that she composed biting poetry about her new husband's nose. Proof that peace in theory didn't always mean harmony at home. Historians still argue whether these marriages actually worked as legal resolutions or if they simply papered over grudges that later reignited. Did forced unions create lasting peace, or were they ticking time bombs of resentment? The sagas hint both ways. Some unions flourished, others soured, becoming fresh sources of drama and gossip. You picture the scene. Two families standing stiffly before the Lorach. The law speaker announces the marriage terms with solemnity, while the crowd tries not to laugh at the groom's sulky expression. Neighbors whisper, "At least no one has to duel," though you sense some prefer dueling over enduring awkward feasts with in-laws. The bride lowers her eyes, her voice steady but her jaw tight, while her relatives nod, satisfied that honor is restored, at least on parchment. In a society without prisons, marriage was a tool as much as a ritual. It created alliances, bound families, and redirected anger into shared meals and children. Yet for the individuals involved, it could feel like punishment wrapped in ceremony. You imagine sitting at your wedding feast, the smell of roasted lamb heavy in the air, while every guest secretly wonders whether you'll manage to stay civil, or whether you'll trade insults again by next spring. A modern aside sneaks in softly. It's like being forced to shake hands with your office rival and then told to share a cubicle with them for 3 years. Peace is technically achieved, but at what cost to your sanity? As the feast ends and the crowd disperses, you hear laughter echoing across the plain, laughter tinged with relief that at least no blood will be spilled today. The couple walks away together, their figures small against the wide Icelandic landscape, bound by law more than affection. The sound of sheep bells follows them, steady and soothing, like a lullaby masking the tension beneath. You wander through the assembly grounds when a boy runs past, laughing, and nearly collides with a farmer leading a goat on a rope. The sight makes you smile, until someone mutters about animal trials. Yes, even the creatures of medieval Iceland sometimes found themselves tangled in the web of law. In a land where livestock was wealth, their behavior could carry legal consequences, and punishment wasn't always limited to humans. The mainstream historical fact. Throughout medieval Europe, animals occasionally stood trial for causing harm, and Iceland was no exception. If a bull gored a man or a horse destroyed valuable property, the case could be brought before the assembly. The owner bore responsibility, of course, but sometimes the animal itself was symbolically punished, banished, sold, or in rare instances, killed as if it acted with intent. The quirky tidbit: some sagas and anecdotes describe animals being treated almost like people in court stories. Imagine a sheep accused of trampling crops, its bleating treated as evidence of guilt. In one tale, a troublesome goat was exiled to a remote valley, as though the poor beast had consciously chosen mischief. The line between legal seriousness and storytelling humor blurred constantly, and the crowd probably chuckled even as they nodded at the verdict. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were actual legal events or more symbolic morality tales. Did assemblies really take time to debate a cow's intentions, or did storytellers exaggerate these episodes to entertain? Without firm records, we're left wandering between fact and folklore, much like the goat sentenced to wander into exile. You picture the scene. A furious farmer accuses his neighbor's ram of breaking through a fence and ruining his hayfield. The law speaker listens solemnly, then announces that the ram must be removed from the district. The crowd snickers, some imitating the ram's bleat, but the judgment stands. Soon the animal is led away, bewildered, its role in the great Icelandic theater of justice complete. The atmosphere lightens with these cases. Unlike duels or outlawry, punishing animals brought a strange mix of seriousness and comedy. It reminded everyone that law touched all corners of life, even the barnyard. And perhaps, on some level, these trials gave people a way to laugh while still acknowledging loss. Blaming the goat at least spared the neighbors from turning on each other with axes. A modern aside floats into your thoughts. It's like suing your printer for eating paper. Deep down, you know it's not the machine's fault, it's the operator, but venting your frustration through ritual feels oddly satisfying. As the goat disappears into the distance, the crowd chuckles, then returns to trading fish and wool. You realize that even animals weren't safe from Iceland's peculiar sense of justice. Yet there's something oddly soothing about it. The image of sheep and goats stumbling into exile, punished not with pain but with relocation, like hairy little outlaws. The bleating fades into the sound of wind brushing across the plain. You feel it soften in your chest, a reminder that in this land, even justice carried a touch of absurdity, and absurdity, in turn, makes sleep easier to find. The crowd is restless again, not because of animals this time, but because of words, specifically insults. You hear the term and murmured once more, but in a different context. Today it isn't about elaborate curses or horsehead poles. It's about ridiculous, even petty slanders that somehow made their way into court. In medieval Iceland, what you called your neighbor mattered almost as much as what you did to them. The mainstream historical fact: Icelandic law codified specific words as legally offensive. Accusations of cowardice, effeminacy, or sexual misconduct could be ground for lawsuits, duels, or fines. These weren't casual jabs. They threatened a person's social standing, which was the backbone of survival. Honor wasn't just pride. It was a currency that kept families safe in a small, tight-knit community. The quirky tidbit: some of the insults recorded in sagas sound almost comical to modern ears. Being called a mare, goat, or even a woman's horse could spark a full legal case. Imagine an entire court debating whether your neighbor's verse comparing you to a farm animal was legally actionable. One saga tells of a man who sued because someone claimed he wore his cloak like a woman, an insult that, while silly today, carried sharp dishonor back then. Historians still argue whether these insults were truly punished every time or whether sagas amplified them for entertainment. Did people really drag each other to court over goat comparisons? Or were these colorful exaggerations meant to keep listeners awake during long winter nights? The lack of clear records leaves us somewhere between genuine legal precedent and centuries-old gossip. You picture the courtroom scene. A man stands fuming while his neighbor smirks. The law speaker recites the accusation. "He called me a mare." The crowd titters. Some try not to laugh, while others nod gravely, understanding that honor is no joke. The verdict? A fine of silver and an official warning not to repeat the insult. Yet you know that by nightfall the whole valley will be chuckling about Mare Snorri, and the punishment only fuels the nickname's persistence. The atmosphere blends comedy and cruelty. On the one hand, it's absurd. Grown men arguing about barnyard names. On the other, it's deadly serious. A misplaced word could spiral into feuds, duels, or outlawry. Icelandic justice tried to contain these sparks by channeling them into fines and shaming before they lit entire valleys on fire. A modern aside drifts in. It's a little like being roasted in a viral meme. You could try suing the poster, but the nickname sticks anyway, and your protest only spreads it further. The sagas were basically Iceland's version of social media. Once your insult made into verse, it lived forever. As the crowd disperses, you hear laughter trailing behind, carried by the wind. The insult has become legend. Its sting dulled by humor, but its permanence sealed by law. In Iceland, ridicule was both weapon and punishment, and somehow, even the most ridiculous cases became part of the grand tapestry of justice. The sound of chuckling mingles with the bleating of sheep in your ears. Slowly, the absurdity smooths into a rhythm, soothing and strange, as if medieval law itself were rocking you gently toward rest. You drift past the laughter of insults and settle into a quieter corner of the assembly, where two farmers stand in dispute. Their issue isn't about nicknames or goats this time. It's about theft. In a land where survival hinged on every sheep and sack of grain, stealing wasn't just impolite. It could unravel the fragile balance of community. The mainstream historical fact. Theft in medieval Iceland was punished, but unlike in some other parts of Europe, mutilation was rare. Hands weren't chopped off, tongues weren't ripped out. Instead, penalties usually meant fines, restitution, or in severe cases, outlawry. The law aimed not to maim, but to restore balance and discourage repeat offenses. The quirky tidbit: some sagas describe thieves caught in the act being humiliated publicly, forced to return the goods in front of everyone, or mocked with stories that would cling to them like burrs. In one tale, a man stole cheese and was forever after remembered with a nickname that made him the butt of jokes at feasts. Imagine your worst snack theft becoming your lifelong brand. Historians still argue whether Icelandic society was unusually lenient with thieves, or whether saga writers downplayed harsher realities. Did thieves often escape with only fines? Or was outlawry more common than the text suggests? The tension between written law and lived experience leaves the picture hazy, much like Iceland's drifting fog. You picture it clearly. A man accused of stealing a sheep is brought before the crowd. The animal bleats loudly nearby, almost as if testifying against him. The law speaker listens, then declares that the thief must pay compensation. Double the sheep's value, perhaps in silver, perhaps in livestock. The crowd nods. His pockets are emptied, his status diminished, and though his hands remain intact, his honor is frayed. The punishment is practical. In a society with no dungeons, what matters is repayment. Everyone sees the balance restored, though the thief's reputation will likely never recover. And for Icelanders, that social scar is often worse than physical pain. A modern aside slips into your mind. It's a little like being caught shoplifting in a small town where everyone knows everyone. You might not face prison, but every cashier and neighbor will remember the story for years. Iceland's valleys were just as gossipy, only with more sheep and fewer convenience stores. As you listen to the murmurs of the crowd, you notice the rhythm of justice again. Not loud, not brutal, but steady. Theft punished not with violence, but with humiliation and restitution. The thief walks away lighter in silver, heavier in shame, and you feel the echo of his footsteps blend into sound of wind over grass. That wind hums gently in your ears now, soothing as it carries away the bleating of sheep and the murmurs of justice. In Iceland, punishment for theft was as much about memory as it was about law. And memory, like the night, lingers long after the fire burns low. The air at Thingvellir grows cooler as the sun dips, though it never fully sets in this northern summer. You hear murmurs about another odd feature of Icelandic justice: timing. Punishments weren't always delivered the moment a verdict was spoken. Often, enforcement waited until the right season, the right gathering, or even the right weather. Law here moved not by the tick of a clock, but by the rhythm of the land. The mainstream historical fact: Iceland's legal year revolved around a summer assembly, the Althing. Many punishments, whether fines, outlawry, or settlements, were announced there, but could only be enforced once everyone returned home. That meant months might pass between judgment and action. Outlawry, for example, usually gave a condemned a grace period, often until the next seasonal marker, before the community treated them as legally outside the law. The quirky tidbit? In some cases, punishments were so season-dependent that criminals effectively had a free pass for months. A man declared an outlaw in midsummer might linger at home until the harsh autumn winds made departure impossible. Neighbors watched him like a storm cloud, but no one moved until the law's calendar allowed. It must have felt both absurd and tense, like living with someone who's technically already gone, but still watering their sheep as though nothing happened. Historians still argue whether this delay was mercy, pragmatism, or weakness in enforcement. Did seasonal timing soften the harshness of law, allowing offenders time to prepare? Or did it reveal how fragile the system was? Depending on weather, travel, and community patience? Some scholars say Icelanders simply accepted it as natural justice, like haymaking followed the seasons. You picture the scene. A man declared lesser outlaw at the Althing nods quietly, then returns home. For weeks, perhaps months, he still tends his farm, harvests hay, and eats with his family, even though everyone knows he must leave soon. Each day is tinged with tension. His children cling tighter, neighbors avoid eye contact, and gossip buzzes like flies. Finally, when summer comes again, he gathers his belongings and departs, the verdict now ripe for enforcement. The rhythm of this justice feels strange to modern ears. We expect immediacy, judges slamming gavels, sentences carried out swiftly. But here, punishment breathes with the land. Exile cannot begin in the middle of winter storms. Fines may not be paid until livestock are ready to be traded. Justice itself is seasonal, like lambing or shearing. A modern aside slides in. Imagine a court sentencing you in July, but telling you, please report to prison next June, once the roads are clear. You live in a surreal limbo. Technically guilty, practically free, but socially marked. That's exactly the twilight space Icelandic punishments occupied. As you let this image settle, you hear the steady beat of time not from clocks, but from hooves and weather. Punishments wait for the right season, the right moment, the right gathering. Justice in Iceland is not a sprint. It's a slow procession, measured by the endless rhythm of daylight and winter darkness. The wind whispers over the plain, carrying with it the sound of grass bending and water trickling through lava rock. You breathe with it, letting the slow, patient timing of medieval law rock you gently like waves on the shore. The light at Thingvellir softens into a silvery glow, and you notice how differently people speak about law once winter is mentioned. In a land where blizzards bury farms and darkness last for months, even punishment had to bend to survival. You hear someone mutter, "Better mercy than more graves," and you realize that harsh winters didn't just freeze rivers, they softened justice. The mainstream historical fact. Icelandic law often reflected the brutal realities of its climate. While outlawry or exile could be decreed, enforcement was sometimes delayed or tempered when winter made survival uncertain. No community wanted to be blamed for sending a man into a snowstorm where he would surely die. Punishment might wait until spring, or be converted into fines if circumstances demanded. Survival always trumped legal perfection. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe cases where neighbors smuggled food to outlaws during storms. Even though it was technically illegal, mercy in the middle of a blizzard was seen as common sense. Because who could watch someone freeze just outside the farm walls? One tale tells an outlaw found sleeping in a hayloft, left undisturbed because a farmer's wife argued, "The snow punishes enough." That line has the ring of Icelandic wisdom. Let nature deliver justice when law feels too cruel. Historians still argue whether this mercy was widespread or exceptional. Were Icelanders regularly lenient in winter, or do the sagas exaggerate moments of compassion? Records are vague, but archaeology shows abandoned homesteads where people clearly clung to survival. Perhaps the community understood that punishing too harshly in winter only created more widows and orphans. Law had to yield to weather, just as everything else did. You picture it clearly. A man sentenced to exile in autumn still lingering near his farm as snow begins to fall. His cloak is thin. His children watch from the doorway, and neighbors pretend not to see him gathering driftwood. Technically, he's outside the law. Practically, no one wants his corpse frozen on their pasture. So he survives the season in a kind of half-shadow, tolerated until spring makes banishment possible. The atmosphere feels different now, less stern, more resigned. People shrug, mutter, and let time pass. Justice itself seems to crawl under a blanket, waiting for the thaw. And in that waiting, mercy takes root, disguised as pragmatism. A modern aside tiptoes in. It's like a school suspending someone but quietly letting them attend during exam week so they don't fail. The punishment still stands, but reality bends the rules. Iceland's winters force the law to do the same. As you listen to wind howl faintly through cracks in the lava, you realize mercy itself is part of Icelandic law. Not written on parchment, but etched in snow. That mercy drifts into your thoughts now, soft and quiet, like a blanket pulled over you against the cold. The wind at Thingvellir carries the smell of smoke from distant cooking fires, but your attention shifts when a man in rough clothes is brought forward. He is no free farmer or proud chieftain. He is a thrall, a slave, and his case stirs murmurs among the assembly. In medieval Iceland, slaves are little standing under the law. Yet even their punishments reveal how strange and uneven justice could be. The mainstream historical fact: slavery, or RLDMR, was legal in Iceland until the 12th and 13th centuries, inherited from Norse customs. Thralls could be bought, sold, or freed, but they had no independent legal rights. If a thrall committed a crime, the responsibility usually fell on their master, who might be fined or shamed. Runaway thralls, however, presented a special problem. Punished harshly to deter others from trying the same. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe runaway slaves being branded, mutilated, or symbolically punished in ways that sound both cruel and absurd. In one tale, a runaway thrall caught hiding in a haystack was forced to wear a collar inscribed with his master's name, as if the man were livestock. Another story mentions thralls being exiled along with their master's goats, as though the animals and humans shared the same status under law. These anecdotes blur the line between punishment and humiliation. Historians still argue whether runaway thralls were treated more brutally in Iceland than elsewhere in the Norse world. Some scholars suggest the small, tightly knit communities made running away nearly impossible, so punishment was mostly symbolic. Others believe thralls were genuinely hunted and killed, their fates harsher than the sagas admit. The truth may be buried in silence, since thralls themselves left no written records. You picture it. A thrall accused of fleeing stand before the assembly, his master red with shame. The law speaker announces that the man must serve double years, or that the master owes compensation for his lost labor. Neighbors nod, not out of pity for the thrall, but because the law values order above personal freedom. The man's fate is sealed not by his own words, he has none to speak, but by the voices of those who own him. The scene is unsettling. Justice here is not blind. It is deeply stratified. Free men duel or pay fines. Women may be shamed or fined. But thralls? Their punishment is often survival itself. Longer bondage, harsher treatment, or nameless exile. A modern aside drifts through your thoughts. It's like blaming a broken laptop and charging a repair fee to the owner. The machine has no say. The master bears the cost. But unlike machines, thralls were living people, their lives absorbed into the legal shadows of others. As the accused is led away, you hear the rustle of whispers fade into the steady hum of the crowd. The thrall's footsteps vanish quickly into anonymity, his punishment swallowed by the indifference of law. For a moment, the Icelandic air feels heavy, not with laughter or absurdity, but with silence that lingers like a shadow on the edge of memory. That silence settles around you now, soft and steady, pulling you deeper into the rhythm of Iceland's peculiar justice, where even the powerless bore punishments designed not for them, but for society that claimed them. The chatter at Thingvellir rises again, and this time it isn't about slaves or goats. You hear the word elder, fire, whisper among the crowd, and it draws your attention like sparks in the dark. Fire, in medieval Iceland, wasn't just warmth and survival. It was also a symbol, a weapon, and occasionally a tool of punishment. You edge closer, watching how flames creep into the edges of law. The mainstream historical fact: fire was woven into Icelandic ritual and punishment. Houses could be burned as part of feuds. and destroying someone's hall was treated as one of the gravest crimes. The law called it brenna, and often led to full outlawry. But fire also appeared in symbolic acts. Torches carried during shaming rituals, hearths extinguished as a mark of dishonor, or objects associated with sorcery burned to purge evil. Fire wasn't just destruction, it was purification. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe men sentenced to carry flaming torches in ceremonies of humiliation, walking through the assembly with smoke curling above their heads as neighbors jeered. In other tales, a hearth was ritually darkened when someone was outlawed, as if erasing their warmth from the community. Imagine being punished not by prison, but by watching your family's fire go cold while everyone else's still glowed against the winter dark. Historians still argue how widespread these symbolic uses of fire really were. Did the Althing regularly employ torch rituals, or are the sagas embellishing for drama? Was extinguishing a hearth a common act, or just a poetic device? The evidence flickers like the flame itself, sometimes steady, sometimes vanishing in smoke. You picture it now. An accused man stands before the crowd, holding a torch that sputters in the wind. He walks slowly, each step echoing in silence. The smoke stings his eyes while children giggle nervously. At the end of the ritual, the torch is extinguished, and with it, his honor. Around him, neighbors whisper that he has become a shadow, a man without flame. The atmosphere is eerie. Fire, usually life's comfort, becomes a marker of shame. You realize how deeply symbolic it was in Icelandic life. The hearth as the center of family, the fire as the heart of home. To lose it was to lose belonging itself. A modern aside drifts in. It's like your Wi-Fi router blinking out while every other house on the street keeps streaming happily. You feel cut off, invisible, no longer connected to the warmth of the network. That's what losing your hearth meant in Iceland. An unplugging from human community. As night draws over the plain, the glow of dozens of campfires flickers across Thingvellir. Smoke rises like thin gray banners, steady and soothing. You let your mind drift with it, the scent of burning with softening into a lullaby. In Iceland, even fire could judge you, and its quiet crackle becomes a rhythm that rocks you deeper toward rest. The next day at Thingvellir, the mood is lighter. Traders are laughing. Children chase each other between tents, and the smell of ale drifts on the breeze. Yet even in this festive air, punishment sometimes found its way into the feast. You realize that in medieval Iceland, justice didn't always unfold in solemn silence. It could happen right in the middle of merrymaking, with laughter and drunken songs echoing through the night. The mainstream historical fact. Feasts were not just social gatherings, but important political arenas. Disputes could be raised, insults hurled, and sometimes punishments declared in front of everyone. A man shamed publicly at a feast might face ridicule worse than any fine, because every guest would carry the story back to their own valleys. The law understood this power. Public humiliation was a tool as effective as exile. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe punishments delivered in the form of drunken ridicule. A man found guilty of slander might be forced to serve ale all night, mocked by the very people he'd insulted. In one tale, a thief was ordered to sing embarrassing verses about himself during a feast, his slurred voice joining the music, while everyone laughed. Imagine karaoke night, but mandated by law and remembered for generations. Historians still argue whether these feast punishments were officially sanctioned or just cultural improvisations. Were they genuine legal sentences? Or did communities use the excuse of a feast to settle scores creatively? The sagas blur the line, weaving law and laughter into stories that leave us unsure where justice ended and comedy began. You picture the scene. Torches flicker on the walls of the longhouse, shadows dancing over carved beams. The air is thick with the smell of roasting lamb and sour ale. A man, red-faced with embarrassment, stumbles between tables with a jug, pouring drinks while guests jeer playfully. Children giggle. Elders shake their heads, and poets compose quick verses mocking his crime. It's punishment, yes, but softened by laughter and ale, a memory that will sting for years, but also amuse. There's a strange comfort in this. Unlike exile or property seizure, feast punishments didn't tear families apart. They bruised pride but left bonds intact. The community laughed together, then carried on balance restored without blood or silence. A modern aside slips in. It's like being roasted at a company holiday party. Embarrassing in the moment, but oddly healing too, because everyone shares a joke. You might never live down the story, but at least you're still invited to the next gathering. As the laughter rises in your ears, it softens into something like a lullaby. You hear the clink of cups, the rhythm of verses, the warm murmur of voices fading into the night. In Iceland, even punishment could be wrapped in laughter, and that laughter drifts now like a gentle song to carry you closer to sleep. The feast dies down, leaving only embers glowing in the hearths and the faint smell of ale lingering in the air. As you wander back toward the Lorrock, you hear a new case being argued, this time about fines not paid in silver, but in animals. Iceland's economy was deeply tied to livestock, and sometimes goats or sheep themselves became the coin of justice. The mainstream historical fact. In a society where silver was scarce, fines would often be settled with goods, especially livestock. Sheep were the backbone of Icelandic survival, providing wool, milk, meat, so they naturally doubled as currency in compensation cases. If a man couldn't pay in silver, goats, cattle, or even fish stockpiles might be accepted as legal tender. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe disputes where the animals themselves became a source of humor or annoyance. A fine might be paid in a stubborn ram that constantly broke fences, or in a goat with a reputation for chewing through cloaks. One tale even mentions a man paying with an unusually loud sheep, and the recipient later complained he'd been tricked into inheriting a nuisance. It's the medieval equivalent of settling your debt with a malfunctioning lawnmower. Historians still argue whether these quirky livestock fines were common practice, or just colorful saga flourishes. Was it really that easy to swap out silver for goats, or were such cases exceptional? Without detailed financial records, we're left to imagine a mix of practicality and playful exaggeration. You picture it. A man leading 3 goats into the assembly ring, tugging at the ropes while the animals bleat stubbornly. The law speaker nods gravely, declaring the fine settled. The victim's family accepts the goats with 4 smiles, already dreading their new noisy companions. The crowd chuckles, shaking their heads at the absurdity of justice measured in bleats and wool. The atmosphere feels lighter here. Livestock fines, though serious in value, carried a touch of comedy. They turned punishment into something tangible, noisy, and slightly ridiculous. Everyone could see, touch, and hear the payment, making justice not just symbolic, but alive. A modern aside fits perfectly. It's like paying a speeding ticket with a truckload of squeaky rubber chickens. The law might accept it, but your neighbors will laugh about it for decades. As the goats are herded away, their bleating fades into the steady hum of the assembly. You find yourself soothed by the rhythm of it. The idea that justice could be counted in footsteps and hoofbeats, in the bleat of sheep rather than the clang of coins. It's oddly comforting, like a lullaby carried on the backs of animals wandering into the distance. The goat's bleating fades, replaced by the lively chatter of families gathered near the edge of the plain. You notice a boy, no more than 15, standing awkwardly before the assembly. His face is pale, his voice trembling. Tonight, the law isn't judging seasoned warriors or shrewd farmers. It's deciding the fate of a youth. You realize that even teenagers weren't immune from Iceland's peculiar punishments, though the approach was often softer, more symbolic. The mainstream historical fact. Icelandic law recognized age as a factor in guilt. Children under a certain age were rarely held fully responsible for crimes. But older youths could be punished, though usually not as harshly as adults. Penalties for young offenders often lean toward restitution, public reprimand, or temporary exclusion, rather than exile or execution. The goal was correction, not destruction. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe punishments that sound almost parental in tone. Lectures from elders, extra chores, or being symbolically exiled to a different household for a season. Imagine being sent to live with your grumpy uncle because you stole a sheep, your punishment half legal ruling, half family babysitting arrangement. In one tale, a teenager caught spreading false boasts was ordered to serve ale at feasts for a year, a kind of public humility training. Historians still argue whether these youth punishments were consistent law or just community improvisation. Were there codified rules for minors, or did each case rely on local judgment and common sense? The laws are vague, and sagas blur fact with narrative flair, leaving us guessing how much mercy was truly given to young offenders. You picture the scene. The boy stares at the ground while the law speaker declares his punishment. No exile, no fines he cannot pay. Instead, he's ordered to work a neighbor's fields for the summer, supervised by stern elders. The crowd nods approvingly, relieved that his punishment restores discipline without destroying his future. His mother sighs with relief. His friends snicker quietly, already imagining the jokes they'll tell at his expense. The atmosphere is different here, less tense, more paternal. You sense the community treating the boy not as a criminal, but as a reminder that youth must be shaped, guided, and humbled before it becomes dangerous. The punishment becomes a story, one that will follow him into adulthood, but also one he might laugh about decades later. A modern aside drifts in. It's like a teenager today getting caught shoplifting and being sentenced to community service instead of jail. Embarrassing, yes, but designed to teach rather than ruin. Icelanders seem to understand that the young still had time to grow into their honor. As the boy is led away, the crowd disperses with gentle chuckles rather than grim silence. The sun lingers low on the horizon, casting a soft glow over the plain. You breathe it in, feeling the gentleness of this justice, a rare pause in a harsh world. It settles over you like a parent's reassuring hand, guiding you softly toward rest. The laughter from the use case fades, but almost immediately another kind of dispute rises from crowd. This one louder, sharper, filled with pointed words and rolling verses. You realize it isn't about theft or fighting. It's about insults woven into poetry, the kind that cut deeper than blades in a land where words outlived wounds. The mainstream historical fact: Icelandic law treated defamatory verses, known as msur, with seriousness. Composing or reciting slanderous poetry could be grounds for lawsuits, fines, or even violence if it dishonored someone's reputation. In a saga-driven culture where poetry was half memory, half weapon, a single mocking stanza could stain a family name for generations. The quirky tidbit? Some of these verses were surprisingly silly. Imagine a court debating whether a rhyme comparing a farmer's beard to a goat's tail was legally offensive. Yet in a society where everyone gathered around fires to repeat verses, even absurd insults stuck. Some sagas describe men suing not because the verse was cruel, but because it was too catchy. Neighbors kept repeating it, turning shame into a folk song. Historians still argue how often courts truly punish poetry, versus how often sagas exaggerated for dramatic flair. Were poets dragged to court regularly, or did writers simply relish the idea of words carrying legal weight? Some scholars suggest that poetry cases symbolize the tension between free expression and communal honor long before modern debates about slander laws. You picture it now. A poet accused of mocking his neighbor's poor harvest. The verse is repeated in court, causing half the crowd to snicker. The law speaker frowns, declaring that the verse dishonored the man and must be compensated with silver and public apology. The poet shrugs, mutters a new rhyme under his breath, and the crowd chuckles again, knowing the punishment will never erase the words. The atmosphere is both absurd and tense. Words, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Law can find the poet, but it cannot stop neighbors from whispering the verse at every feast. Reputation is fragile, and Icelanders guarded it fiercely, even against rhyme. A modern aside drifts into your thoughts. It's like being roasted in a viral TikTok. You could sue, you might win damages, but the clip will still spread, played at every party long after case ends. Medieval Iceland had no internet, but its sagas functioned the same way. Once your shame was sung, it lived forever. As the crowd disperses, you hear the verse repeated one last time, its rhythm carried by the wind. The sound lingers in your ears, half mocking, half musical, until it begins to feel like a lullaby. You close your eyes, rocked by the notion that even insults could sing you softly towards sleep in Iceland's peculiar courts. The murmurs of mocking verses still linger when another case is called forward, and this one makes you raise an eyebrow. It isn't about land duels or outlawry. It's about food, or rather, the lack of it. You realize that in medieval Iceland, even what a person ate or didn't eat could be turned into a punishment. The mainstream historical fact. Fasting and food restrictions were occasionally used as penalties, particularly under the influence of church law. A guilty party might be ordered to live on bread and water for a certain period, or to abstain from ale during feasts. These punishments weren't about starving people, but about humbling them in front of the community, stripping away pleasures that marked status and belonging. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas and anecdotes suggest punishments where food itself became a tool of ridicule. A man accused of drunken misconduct might be banned from ale for a year, forced to drink only milk at gatherings. Imagine standing at a feast while everyone else downs frothy mugs, and you're stuck with a bowl of sour milk, your lips curdling along with your pride. In other cases, families might refuse to share food with an offender, turning mealtime into a stage for exclusion. Historians still argue how widespread these food-based punishments were. Were they genuinely common, or were they more symbolic? Performed at feasts for spectacle rather than as lasting discipline? The lines blur, but evidence suggests that withholding food, or forcing bland diets, was one way Icelanders linked bodily needs to moral lessons. You picture it. A man found guilty of insulting his neighbor is sentenced not to exile or fines, but to serve penance by eating nothing but dry bread for weeks. At the next feast, he sits glumly at the end of the bench, while others devour roasted lamb. His humiliation isn't just hunger, it's exclusion from joy. The crowd chuckles as he chews his tasteless crust, and his shame is chewed right along with it. The atmosphere feels oddly intimate. Punishment by food or by the denial of it cut directly into the rhythms of daily life. It didn't remove someone from the community. It marked them within it. Every meal became a reminder of guilt. A modern aside slides into your thoughts. It's like being sentenced to attend office pizza parties, but only allowed to eat salad. Technically, you're still included, but everyone knows you're being punished. Icelanders found similar ways to balance justice and belonging, mixing discipline with visibility. As the feast noises echo in your ears, the clink of cups, the crunch of roasted meat, you let yourself drift with the thought of bread and water punishments. The monotony of the diet, the steady chewing, the slow rhythm of exclusion, it all feels strangely lulling, like the soft drumbeat of sleep calling you closer. The clink of mugs fades into the steady hum of conversation, and you overhear another curious detail about Icelandic justice. The way punishments were timed not only by assemblies, but by the seasons themselves. Law in this land was as much about the calendar as it was about crime. You lean closer, because this is a society where summer could save you and winter could kill you. The mainstream historical fact. Exile and outlawry often began at specific seasonal markers. A man declared outlaw at the Althing in midsummer had until a set date, sometimes 3 months, to leave. That grace period wasn't just kindness. It was recognition of Iceland's brutal geography. Sending someone into exile during deep winter was effectively a death sentence, so punishments were scheduled when survival was possible. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe offenders deliberately timing their crimes to exploit these seasonal rhythms. If you committed an offense just before winter, your exile might be delayed until spring, giving you months of semi-freedom at home. One tale even mentions a man smugly remarking that the snow was his best lawyer, since no one could chase him through the drifts until the thaw. It's a loophole only nature could provide. Historians still argue whether this seasonal leniency reflected mercy or mere pragmatism. Was it compassion to let families survive the cold months together? Or was it simply impossible to enforce harsh sentences when blizzards buried the land? The sagas hint at both. Neighbors sometimes grumbled at delays, while others shrugged and said, "The law sleeps in snow." You picture it. A man declared outlaw in midsummer packs slowly, knowing he has until autumn to depart. He still tends his sheep, still eats at his hearth, but each day feels heavy with the knowledge that soon he'll be gone. Winter arrives early, storms howl across the valleys, and suddenly his exile is postponed. He lingers, neither free nor fully punished, like a shadow waiting for spring's light to push him out. The atmosphere feels suspended, as if justice itself is curled beneath a blanket of snow. Families whisper, unsure whether to treat the man as guilty or still part of the community. Children still greet him, but neighbors avert their eyes. He lives in limbo, his punishment stretched thin across the seasons. A modern aside drifts in. It's like being sentenced to start a jail term in June, but winter storms delay your reporting date until the following year. You live in a surreal twilight, guilty but still at home, everyone watching, waiting for the law's clock to tick again. As you imagine the snow-muffling footsteps, the idea becomes soothing. Punishment tied to seasons feels less like law and more like nature itself whispering judgment. The wind carries the rhythm of winter and spring, of exile delayed and enforced, and that rhythm lulls you gently toward rest. The hush of seasonal law still lingers when you hear a murmur that feels stranger than all the rest. A farmer steps forward, not with evidence of theft or insult, but with a dream. He claims a vision told him his neighbor had cursed his cattle, and suddenly the assembly listens seriously. You realize that in medieval Iceland, even dreams and visions could sway verdicts, as at the boundary between sleep and waking life dissolved under the northern sky. The mainstream historical fact. Sagas and legal anecdotes show that supernatural signs, dreams, omens, visions were sometimes treated as supporting evidence in disputes. A dream might not convict someone outright, but it could add weight to accusations of sorcery, dishonor, or hidden guilt. In a society steeped in folklore, people believed dreams carried messages from God, spirits, or fate itself. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas record almost comical dream testimonies. One man swore he dreamed of a neighbor sneaking into his barn and whispering to the sheep. Another claimed his wife dreamt of a goat talking in human words, warning of theft. The assembly listened, sometimes chuckling, sometimes nodding gravely. Dreams were never dismissed outright. They were part of the conversation, a curious blend of court evidence and campfire tale. Historians still argue whether dreams truly influenced judgments or were more rhetorical flourishes in sagas. Did Icelanders honestly treat sleep visions as legal tools, or did writers exaggerate these moments to entertain audiences? The debate continues, leaving us adrift between fact and folklore, exactly where dreams belong. You picture the scene. The farmer recounts his dream, voice trembling. He describes strange shapes, whispers of sorcery, ominous shadows over his sheep. The law speaker tilts his head, considering. The crowd murmurs, some skeptical, others deeply impressed. Finally, the verdict blends practical law with dream-born suspicion. The accused must pay a fine, not because the dream proves guilt, but because the fear it stirs cannot be ignored. The atmosphere is eerie. Justice here doesn't live only in facts, but in imagination, in whispers from the unconscious. A dream told in the right tone can shape reality. Steering law like wind fills a sail. A modern aside tiptoes in. It's like testifying in court today that you saw the culprit in a Netflix binge-induced dream, and somehow the jury leans forward instead of laughing. Absurd to us, but for Icelanders, dreams were serious business, blurring law and lore. As the farmer's story fades, you feel the edges of your own mind soften. Dreams themselves become law in this world, and their surreal images flow into your thoughts. Sheep whispering, goats speaking, shadows curling over barns. The lull of imagination rocks you until the line between waking and sleep feels thinner than ever. The murmured dream fades into the night air, and now you hear a different kind of case being whispered through the assembly. This one isn't about sorcery or animals or insults. It's about enforcement itself. In Iceland, law wasn't carried out by faceless officers or guards. It was enforced by neighbors, kin, and communities, which made every punishment both deeply personal and inescapably public. The mainstream historical fact. Medieval Iceland had no central police force. When someone was fined, outlawed, or sentenced, it fell to the community to enforce the verdict. Neighbors might refuse to trade with the guilty party. Families might shun them, and kin groups were responsible for ensuring fines were paid. If a man declared outlaw lingered too long, it was the community's job to drive him away or, in grim cases, kill him. The quirky tidbit? Enforcement could sometimes resemble coordinated ostracism rather than direct action. People might quietly stop speaking to the punished man, refusing to share food, help, or even acknowledge his presence. Imagine walking through your valley while everyone acts as though you're invisible. It was psychological punishment, heavy as exile, and sometimes more enduring. In one saga, an outlaw begged a farmer for milk, and the farmer poured on the ground rather than give him a sip. Justice delivered in silence. Historians still argue whether communities enforce these laws uniformly, or whether personal alliances and grudges decided who was punished and who was quietly tolerated. Did neighbors always comply, or did they sometimes ignore verdicts when sympathy outweighed law? The sagas tell stories both ways. Merciless ostracism in some valleys, quiet leniency in others. You picture it. A man declared outlaw still living in his farmhouse, his fields unworked, his children thin. He approaches a market, but people turn away. The blacksmith refuses to sharpen his blade. The weaver pretends not to hear him ask for cloth. It's exile without leaving, punishment delivered by silence, sharper than any blade. The atmosphere is heavy, but also practical. With no sheriffs or dungeons, law survived only because communities enforced it together. The cost was social fabric itself. Neighbors forced to play the role of judge and warden. Households strained by the weight of shared responsibility. A modern aside sneaks in. It's a little like cancel culture in a village of 200 people. Once your name is spoken to Althing, everyone treats you as erased, and survival becomes nearly impossible. It wasn't hashtags that silenced you, but the daily refusal of food, trade, or even a nod of acknowledgement. As the whispers fade, you feel the strange hum of communal justice settle into your chest. Enforcement in Iceland was never distant. It was carried out by the very people you depended on for life. That intimacy of punishment hums like a low drone, oddly soothing, as though the silence of neighbors have become a lullaby rocking you into deeper rest. The hush of communal enforcement still lingers in your mind when a new case is called, one that makes a crowd smirk knowingly. A clever farmer stands accused, not of theft, not of sorcery, but of bending the rules so thoroughly that the spirit of the law seems to slip right through his fingers. You realize that in medieval Iceland, punishments weren't just about crime. They were about closing loopholes that crafty minds kept trying to exploit. The mainstream historical fact. Icelandic law was famously intricate, full of detailed clauses and exceptions. People often hired skilled advocates, usually chieftains or wise men, to interpret these rules in their favor. Sometimes a case was won not because someone was innocent, but because their defender found a clever technicality. The law was as much about rhetoric and memory as about right or wrong. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas tell of absurd loopholes. In one tale, a man accused of killing another argued that technically he hadn't struck the fatal blow. His axe had slipped while he was just swinging it nearby. Another story describes a defendant claiming he hadn't violated exile because he stood on a skerry, a tiny rock out at sea, just outside the district boundary. Picture a grown man clinging to a slippery rock, shouting, "Still legal," while neighbors rolled their eyes. Historians still argue whether these legal acrobatics were widespread or exaggerated for saga drama. Was Iceland really a land of loophole lawyers, or did storytellers simply relish the comedy of cleverness outwitting law? Surviving manuscripts show technical language, but the sagas provide the laughter, leaving us with a blurred picture of law as both serious and absurd. You picture it clearly. The farmer grins as he explains why his offense doesn't technically count. The law speaker frowns, mutters, and flips through his memorized clauses, only to realize the man has a point. The assembly murmurs, some impressed, others irritated. Finally, a new clause is added, closing the loophole, and the farmer walks away smirking, his punishment lighter than expected. The atmosphere feels almost theatrical. Icelandic law wasn't rigid stone. It was clay, molded case by case, story by story. Each clever defense reshaped the code, leaving loopholes patched with new words. Justice was alive, and everyone played a part in editing it. A modern aside drifts in. It's like someone today insisting they didn't break the no shoes in the pool rule, because technically they were wearing socks. Everyone groans. The lifeguard updates the sign and the loophole dies, but not before the story spreads. As the farmer leaves, his grin lingers like a shadow across the plain. The crowd chuckles, shaking their heads, already retelling the loophole as entertainment for the winter nights. And as you listen, the absurdity melts into rhythm. Law as storytelling, loopholes as lullabies, the steady hum of human cleverness rocking you gently deeper into rest. The laughter over loopholes fades into a quieter, sharper case. A woman steps forward, her hands clenched at her sides, while neighbors whisper behind their cloaks. This isn't about theft or sorcery. It's about gossip. You realize that in Iceland, loose tongues were treated almost as seriously as loose swords, because words had the power to ruin households and ignite feuds. The mainstream historical fact: gossip and slander were punishable under Icelandic law. False accusations, spreading damaging rumors, or repeating dishonorable stories could result in fines, shaming, or in extreme cases, outlawry. In a society where honor and reputation were essential to survival, even idle chatter could be legally dangerous. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe punishments that seem half comic, half cruel. A gossiper might be fined not only in silver, but also in livestock that match their tongue, like a sheep with an especially noisy bleat. One tale tells a man forced to sit in silence at feasts for a year, forbidden to speak unless directly addressed. Imagine being sentenced to a year-long quiet game while everyone else gossips freely. Historians still argue how much gossip was truly policed versus tolerated. Did every whisper end up in court, or were only the most damaging cases punished? The sagas exaggerate for effect, but the surviving law codes show a surprising amount of space devoted to speech offenses. Clearly, Icelanders feared the tongue's power to inflame as much as the axe's power to kill. You picture it. The woman stands accused of spreading rumors about her neighbor's daughter. The law speaker listens, frowning, then declares her guilty. She must pay a fine and stand at the next feast without speaking, while others recite verses mocking her chatter. The crowd chuckles, the punishment delivered not in blows, but in silence and shame. The atmosphere is tense, but tinged with humor. Everyone knows gossip is both irresistible and dangerous. Punishing it publicly turns whispers into lessons, reminding the community that words can destroy as surely as blades. A modern aside sneaks in. It's like getting banned from group chats for spreading false rumors. Only in Iceland, the ban came with bleeding goats as receipts. As the accused lowers her head and the crowd disperses, you hear the faint murmur of voices around you. Softer now, more cautious, as if the air itself has learned restraint. The sound becomes a gentle hum in your ears, like a lullaby stitched from whispers, reminding you that silence, too, can soothe. The hum of cautious whispers fades when a new figure steps forward, one who clearly doesn't quite belong. His clothes mark him as Irish, his accent different, his posture hesitant. The crowd leans in curious, because foreigners in Iceland face the law too, but not always in the same way as locals. You realize that justice here bent oddly when outsiders were involved. The mainstream historical fact: Iceland's population was a mix of Norse settlers and people of Celtic origin, often Irish or Scottish, foreign traders, sailors, and even slaves occasionally appeared before the Althing. The law technically applied to all, but in practice, outsiders were judged through shifting lenses. Sometimes they received harsher penalties, sometimes lighter, depending on their usefulness, alliances, or sheer strangeness. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe foreigners punished in bizarre or symbolic ways. An Irish sailor accused of theft was once fined in fish rather than silver, because the crowd joked, "Fish is what he smells of." Another story mentions a Greenlander who tried to use his own customs as defense, only to be laughed at and sentenced to exile back to the ice. Punishments weren't always uniform. They were flavored with local humor and suspicion. Historians still argue whether Icelandic law genuinely protected foreigners, or simply tolerated them until conflict arose. Did outsiders receive fair trials, or were judgments shaped by prejudice and politics? The record is murky, leaving us to piece together fragments from sagas where foreigners appear more as colorful side characters than as equals in law. You picture it. The Irishman accused of insulting a local farmer stammers in broken Norse. The law speaker frowns, the crowd chuckles at his accent, and the verdict is announced. A fine of livestock, to be collected not in his home valley but by the man he offended. The punishment feels less about the crime, more about reinforcing who belongs and who doesn't. The atmosphere carries a mix of curiosity and distance. Locals whisper, some amused, others wary. For the foreigner, the punishment isn't just exile or fine. It's being reminded he is forever other, judged not only by law but by belonging. A modern aside drifts in. It's like getting fined in monopoly money while visiting a foreign court. Technically a penalty, but also a reminder you're playing someone else's game. As the foreigner bows awkwardly and disappears in the crowd, you feel the quiet weight of difference linger. The community resumes its rhythm, but the outsider's shadow trails off across the plain. That shadow becomes soft in your mind, stretched thin against the horizon, until it feels like a gentle reminder that even punishment carries accents, dialects, and distance. The foreigner's shadow drifts away, and you hear another case being called, one that hushes the crowd in a different way. A man accused of murder stands before the law speaker, his face hard, his kin gathered behind him. Everyone knows the crime is grave, yet what strikes you most is the absence of one word: execution. In Iceland, unlike so many corners of medieval Europe, death penalties were rare. Instead, exile, outlawry, was the preferred sentence, the mainstream historical fact. While executions did occur in Iceland, they were remarkably uncommon compared to other societies of the time. Outlawry was a standard punishment for murder, arson, or severe crimes. It expelled the criminal from legal protection, letting the community wash its hands of the offender without directly spilling more blood. This preference shaped Iceland's reputation as a society of banishment rather than gallows. The quirky tidbit? Some sagas describe almost executions that stopped just short. In one, a man condemned to death for sorcery was instead given the choice of exile, with the assembly muttering that the land will deal with him. Another tale mentions a criminal tied to a stake, only for the punishment to be converted at the last moment into outlawry, as if Icelanders were reluctant to finish what they started. Death was avoided not because crime was excused, but because execution itself felt like crossing a line. Historians still argue why execution was so rare. Was it practical, avoiding the cycle of revenge that followed a killing? Was it religious restraint, especially after Christian conversion? Or was it simply the Icelandic way, to let the wilderness serve as executioner? The sagas leave the question open, their silence almost as telling as their words. You picture the accused now. The law speaker declares him a full outlaw, his farm seized, his kin disgraced. No headsman steps forward. No blade glints in the sun. Instead, the man is told to leave Iceland within weeks. If he lingers, anyone may kill him with impunity. Death remains possible, but it is indirect, delegated to the land, the people, and fate. The atmosphere is tense, but also oddly restrained. Where another society might cheer an execution, here the crowd watches in silence, knowing a man's exile is punishment enough. They picture him wandering across lava fields, hungry, hunted, alone. No spectacle, no blood, just disappearance into the margins of the island. A modern aside sneaks in. It's like banning someone permanently from social media rather than prosecuting them in court. They don't vanish entirely. You might still see glimpses. But officially, they no longer exist in the community. Icelanders invented their own form of deplatforming, centuries before hashtags. As the outlaw trudges away, his figure shrinking against the horizon, you feel the calmness of absence settle around you. Execution replaced by silence, death by disappearance. The punishment hums softly in your ears, like wind over empty fields, carrying you gently toward rest. The outlaw's figure fades into the horizon, but the echoes of his fate linger in the air. Around the campfires, people begin to murmur stories, not just about him, but about others long gone, whose punishments had already slipped from law into legend. You realize that in Iceland, justice lived on not in dusty records, but in sagas, where peculiar penalties became immortal, stitched into the great quilt of memory, the mainstream historical fact. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserve countless references to punishments from earlier centuries. These stories don't just recount feuds and heroes. They detail fines, outlawries, and humiliations, embedding legal history into narrative form. For a society without centralized archives, sagas became the record, mixing fact with art. The quirky tidbit? Saga writers loved exaggerating punishments for dramatic flair. A fine of goats might be retold as a comical curse of bleeding. A shaming song might become a full feast-long chorus. Even minor insults were elevated to epic proportions, so that listeners could laugh, gasp, and remember. Some sagas even retrofitted punishments into old tales, making legendary figures suffer laughably specific penalties. Imagine telling your grandchildren that a famous warrior was once nicknamed Dungbeard and punished by carrying torches and sheep dung. It might not be strictly true, but it stuck. Historians still argue how much of these saga punishments reflect real practice versus literary invention. Did skalds deliberately exaggerate to keep audiences awake during long winters? Or were they preserving kernels of real legal memory? The sagas blur truth and entertainment so thoroughly that law itself becomes a kind of bedtime story. You picture it now. A family gathered in a turf house, firelight flickering across carved beams. A skald recites a tale of an outlaw forced to wander in winter, of a thief humiliated with a mocking nickname, of a gossip silenced at a feast. Children giggle, elders nod, and the story is repeated again the next night, until punishment becomes myth. The atmosphere is warm, even cozy. Punishments that once broke lives now entertain, transformed into narrative threads that bind generations. The harshness of exile or shame softens into rhythm, becoming part of a collective lullaby whispered across centuries. A modern aside floats in. It's like a meme that outlives its context. The original story might fade, but the joke, the image, the rhythm survive, becoming legend in their own right. Icelanders turned punishments into memes long before the internet, carried not by pixels, but by poetry. As the skald's voice trails off, you hear the crackle of the hearth, the sigh of sleepers drifting off with sagas in their ears. Justice becomes story, story becomes dream, and dream becomes rest. You feel yourself sinking into that rhythm, as if the sagas themselves are tucking you under a blanket of memory. The last fire at Thinglar burns low, casting only faint shadows across the rocky plain. The crowd has dispersed, the dispute settled, the punishments pronounced. What lingers now is not the noise of trials or the laughter of feasts, but the quiet knowledge that Icelandic law lived as much in memory as in the moment. You realize you walked through a world where punishment was not just exile or fines. It was humiliation, ritual, and story stitched together by the voices of neighbors beneath a sky that never fully darkened. The mainstream historical fact: Iceland's medieval legal system endured for centuries without kings or central rulers, built on the Althing, memory, and consensus. Punishments reflected that fragility, always aimed at restoring balance without tearing the community apart. Outlawry, fines, and shaming all carried the same goal: to keep people alive through winter, to prevent feuds from becoming endless, and to remind everyone that survival depended on cooperation. The quirky tidbit: some punishments became so memorable that they outlived the laws themselves. Long after the Gragas Code faded, people still recall peculiar stories. Goats exiled like criminals, nicknames immortalized in sagas, fines paid in bleeding livestock. The line between justice and joke blurred until punishments became as entertaining as they were instructive. Even today, reading those laws feels less like flipping through statutes and more like browsing a very old, very strange storybook. Historians still argue whether Iceland's peculiar punishments were practical, symbolic, or mostly saga embellishments. Were trials by ordeal and shaming rituals as common as the text suggests? Or were they dramatic outliers remembered because they were unusual? Perhaps the truth lies in the mix, where practicality met poetry, and justice was shaped as much by memory as by fact. You picture it one last time, the Althing plain empty now, the lower rock silent. Only the wind moves, whispering across lava fields, carrying with it centuries of judgments, laughter, and exile. Turf houses glow faintly in the distance, each hearth alive, each family safe for the night. Somewhere, a skald repeats the stories of outlaws wandering forests, of feasts where men poured ale as punishment, of goats that paid for crimes. The atmosphere is calm, almost timeless. Punishment has shifted into memory, memory into legend. The land itself seems to sigh, as if content to hold the echoes of law within its valleys and stones. A modern aside tiptoes in. It's like a bedtime storybook that was never meant to soothe children, yet somehow, through repetition, becomes a lullaby for centuries. Iceland's law was harsh in places, humorous in others, but always rhythmic. Always something that people carried into long nights. And as you let the last ember fade in your mind, you realize the journey through Iceland's peculiar punishments has become its own kind of ritual. Not a judgment, not a duel, but a story that stretches out, steady and soft, until sleep itself arrives like exile, gentle, inevitable, and oddly merciful. Now the journey quiets, the noise of the assembly fading until only the soft wind remains. You feel it brushing over the plains of Thingvellir, cool and steady, carrying away the voices of law speakers, poets, and farmers. Their disputes are finished, their punishments decided. What endures is not exile or fine, but the rhythm of memory, slow, steady, soothing. Let yourself picture the turf houses again, their walls covered in moss, their hearts glowing with gentle fire. Families gather close, their voices low, telling sagas not of heroes and battles, but peculiar punishments that once amused or unsettled their ancestors. The laughter is soft, the shadows long, the stories drifting like smoke until they blur into dreams. You breathe slower now, in time with that rhythm. Inhale the scent of peat fires. Exhale the sound of sheep bells in the distance. Imagine the snow lying quiet over the land, muffling footsteps, silencing feuds. Justice sleeps beneath it, waiting for spring, but you needn't wait. You can rest now, here in a hush where history softens into story. There are no more duels to witness, no more insults to weigh, no more goats to exile, only the quiet glow of memory, the steady hum of wind, the gentle lull of voices fading into silence. Let the last ember die away. Let the dark wrap around you, soft and kind. In this silence, you are safe. The sagas close, the punishments dissolve, and the night itself becomes a cradle. Drift now, slowly, gently, into dreams where nothing is judged, nothing is feared. Only rest, only peace, only sleep,